that others can point to. So maybe you can share some of the best practices that we highlighted in the document itself.
Sure, there are. I know that in terms of especially the self-attestation, I think that's just like a mental hang up a lot of cities have. You know, they want to make sure that they're following the rules, that there's no question that the federal government won't come back seeking a clawback because for some reason a resident who didn't qualify got aid. But we've seen the data clearly, I think from the Eviction Lab and others, that self-attestation does not increase the risk that someone who isn't eligible for the program will participate. In fact, it increases the uptake. So we know in the Oakland area, and I think San Leandro, those are two cities where their provider has chosen to allow self-attestation, and it's working, and we recommend it in the document as a model for other cities to follow. That's the only one that comes to mind off the top of my head because I don't have the report open in front of me.
Yeah, I would point out too, in Washington State has done a really excellent job of centering racial equity in the work, and the state of Colorado, we highlight them as a best practice for having done important work with outreach to landlords to get them to participate in the program. And I would also call out Santa Clara, California as a place that ensured that impacted people had a voice and a really important role in designing the program so that it worked best for them. So we do list out in the document some best practices that you all can take a look at and work to replicate in your communities.
Yeah, and I just gave it a once over again. And we do highlight Los Angeles too for being a community that's been pioneering direct aid to renters where the landlord has chosen not to participate or just has chosen or doesn't know anything about the program. So so that's another good place to look.
Yeah, great. And some people are putting some other best practices in the chat and Q&A box. Somebody mentioned Seattle and a few other places. Let's see. Some Dorcas Moore is, I think, agreeing and underscoring the importance of outreach to landlords. They're noting that there's many landlords who may be skittish about working with the government, and outreach, especially to small landlords, is needed. We certainly agree. There's a question on, oh, Marla Klein is also saying Seattle King County also does self-attestation. Yes, thank you. I think that's all the questions specific to this resource for right now, Mike, but I wanted to say too, again, there's lots of people saying thank you and this is helpful. So I wanted to thank you again, Mike, and to thank all of your colleagues at National League of City who helped with this resource. Also to shout out Elena Calabro and Sarah Sadian from NLIHC who worked on this, and the research team who helped with all of the underlying conclusion and the best practices that we highlighted. And Mike, would also love to have you back in the future to talk about that larger pot of money.
Yeah, we're waiting for it. Guidance could come as early as this week. We know there's this is the first time ever that every local government across the country will be given resources to make sure government operations are stabilized. But like I said, really to make sure that their cities are taking care of residents and households and small businesses so that they can get back to maybe not back to normal, but a new kind of normal as quickly as they can.
Yeah. So we'd love to have you back in the future whenever that guidance is out, so you can share an overview and any materials that you're putting together for communities to use it to best assist local people for housing needs. So thanks so much, Mike.
Yep. Thank you, Diane. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care. Okay. Also, actually, I just remembered the other thing that I had wanted to say, which is that we're going to be NLIHC and National League of Cities are going to be putting together a webinar to go more in depth on all of these suggestions that we have for equitable ERA programs. And we'll be lifting up some of the best practices. We'll be hearing from some mayors, potentially governors, and we'll be hearing from some senior officials at the White House as well. And we're aiming to do that webinar the week of May 10th. And as soon as we have that date settled, we'll share that out with all of you. So we're going to stay on the topic of emergency rental assistance, and I'm going to turn to my colleagues now at NLIHC, Rebecca Ye and Mitu Nair, to share the latest on our tracking of ERA programs. So Rebecca and Neetu, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the call today. My colleague Rebecca and I will provide some updates on the latest with rental assistance programs that we're tracking. So as of May 3rd, our database includes over 920 programs, 300 of which are from the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And we know a total of 691 jurisdictions receive direct allocations from Treasury, and we'll be monitoring these closely. All of the programs that we track are consolidated on our rental assistance webpage within the larger NLIHC website. Next slide, please. So here are some updates on where we currently stand. We've recorded 300 programs in our database representing 365 different jurisdictions. This difference is because several programs have combined their direct allocations between cities and counties or joined the state program in some cases. Nearly 73% of the state, cities, counties that have received direct allocations from Treasury are represented in our database now. Of the 300 programs in our database, we have 45 state programs, 214 city and county programs, and 41 territory or tribal government programs, which is representing just over 18 billion out of the 25 billion that was allocated under the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to sort of give you some initial observations from these programs that we've tracked so far.
Thanks, Neetu. I'll be covering a few areas of concern where we're seeing that programs may not be using the flexibility given to them, but should be, so that they can better serve tenants and more efficiently disperse funding. Excessive documentation requirements for tenants were a really significant challenge for previous CARES Act funded emergency rental assistance programs, and resulted in incomplete applications and really slowed administrators down in processing applications. As Mike mentioned just a few minutes earlier, applications really need to be simplified and programs need to use self-attestation. It's really one of the most important tools in the toolbox to reach tenants in the most precarious situations, and guidance from Treasury allows the use of self-attestation for showing COVID-related hardship, housing instability, income, and in cases where tenants lack formal leases, to show their rental obligation with some alternative proof of residency. However, only about 31% of Treasury emergency rental assistance programs explicitly permit self-attestation in their application processes. If you've been listening for the past couple of weeks, you'll notice that the share of programs using self-attestation has gone up a little bit. We've added a number of programs this past week that included self-attestation for COVID hardship. So in total, 55 programs are allowing self-attestation for COVID hardship, 48 are allowing self-attestation for income in some way, and 12 are allowing self-attestation for showing housing instability. There may be some programs that are allowing for self-attestation more quietly, but they really need to be more explicit, as tenants may be deterred from applying if they see, for example, that income documentation is necessary, but they're unemployed and are not receiving unemployment insurance, or they're paid in cash or work in the gig economy. This is an area where advocates really have a continued opportunity to educate and influence program decision makers. And similarly, moving on to another key issue, while the statute makes clear that programs can directly pay tenants if landlords decline to participate or are unresponsive, less than 1 in 5 or 17% of Treasury emergency rental assistance programs exercise this option. Several programs actually explicitly state that there's no alternative for these tenants, and that applications will be dismissed without landlords. There are a number of situations in which landlords will simply be unresponsive, and there really must be recourse for these tenants, including access to rental assistance in case landlords decline to participate, connection to legal services, and potentially relocation services depending on the circumstances. So I will stop there for now and pause for questions. Thank you all for having us.
Great, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Neetu. And just as a reminder to everybody on the call, Rebecca, Neetu, and others at the NLIHC team, Emma and Andrew, are updating this database of all ERA programs 3 times a week, so you can check back frequently to find new information. And of course, they'll be on the weekly calls to continue sharing updates. Rebecca or Neetu, I wanted to see if you could answer this question from Paul Leonard, who is asking whether we have data or information on whether local rental assistance programs are using technology platforms to enable renters to apply and to work with counselors if they need assistance.
Sure, I can start tackling that question. Neetu, if you have any thoughts, please join. You know, we are not actively collecting that data, but we are noticing a couple of different trends on some softwares that are quite popular. Neighborly is one of the more popular ones, but there are a couple of common vendors that we've seen around this. And so I think that that is something that we're you know, wanting to look more into.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think that's all the questions for now. So thank you both. Oh, and I just want to let everybody know, a reminder, we've talked about this in previous calls as well, but the issues that Rebecca raised are areas of concern and ones that we're tracking closely. And we've written, put them down and have shared data, written a letter to the Department of Treasury, to the Domestic Policy Council at the White House, to the Department of HUD, and continue to share with them data on what we're finding, what we're tracking. And they are, I believe, taking these concerns very seriously. And I'm hopeful that sometime soon they will share new information or new guidance, really encouraging communities to use the flexibility that they have to ensure that these resources get to the households who need them the most. So hopefully more to come on that, and certainly we'll share more news on that when we have it and when we can. There was a question about why landlords are why some landlords are refusing to participate, and I think there's a few reasons why landlords are refusing to participate that we're seeing. Some of the larger corporate landlords seem to be making a calculation that they prefer to just eat the lost cost of rent arrears, wait until they can evict tenants and get new tenants in. And some of them talk about complexity because their properties go across state lines. And so there's multiple programs to have to manage. Some landlords, just as some low-income tenants may have trouble giving documentation, some other landlords, it seems, prefer not to have to give documentation, their own documentation, and that can be a barrier. And in some places, programs are trying to find the balance between addressing rent arrears and providing some longer-term housing stability for renters who need it. And so they create programs that have concessions that landlords are required to agree to in order to get the rent arrears. So for example, in some communities, a program might pay 80% of the arrears that are owed if the landlord will forgive the remaining 20%. Or in some cases, program administrators will provide the rent arrears that are owed if the landlord agrees not to evict for some period of time or not to raise rent for some period of time. And for some landlords, those concessions are fine. They're agreeing, they're participating in the program. For others, they don't want to agree to those concessions and so refuse to participate. And in any of those cases, of course, if the application is closed because a landlord refuses to participate, it's the tenant who's most harmed because they continue to carry that debt and those rent arrears. So we have to ensure that programs are using the flexibility that they have available to them to provide direct to tenant assistance when needed, and also to provide housing relocation services and forward for future rent assistance where needed to provide that longer term housing stability for some tenants. So more to come on all of this. Continue checking our database. We'll have up-to-date information on all of the programs that we're tracking, and we'll share more news from the Department of Treasury and the White House on this soon. So I'm going to turn now to some of our field updates. And I'm going to start with Erin Kahn, who's with All in Washington to talk about their vaccine equity initiative. So Erin, I'll turn to you. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me, and someone's going to navigate the slides on my behalf. Hi, I'm Erin with All in Washington, representing Washington State, and I'm here to give an update on an initiative we've been doing focused on vaccine equity efforts. Next slide, please. So All in Washington is a coordinated statewide effort to address the impacts of COVID-19. It's essentially a grant-making fund that we've been running since June with a variety of focus areas. And the most recent round of grants is that I'm going to talk about today focused on vaccine equity, but previously we've been doing grant making across Washington State, totaling a little over $15 million to a variety of organizations working on issues that will provide relief to disproportionately impacted communities. And I'm sorry you're all hearing my new puppy barking madly in the background. Next slide, please. So the Vaccine Equity Initiative is focused on ensuring more equitable access to vaccines, because what we were observing is groups that had been disproportionately impacted by COVID were also experiencing lower rates of vaccination, and we wanted to do something about that. So we are offering grants of up to $50,000 for community-based organizations to address a wide range of barriers to vaccination. That includes providing linguistically and culturally specific messaging and outreach so that people who are curious about getting vaccinated can receive fact-based information in a language and format that will be resonant for them. We're also investing grant dollars to support outreach and registration. So community-based groups reaching out to their constituencies to let them know about vaccination opportunities and to help them with registration support. We are also funding a lot of groups to do actual vaccine events, so mobile or pop-up or site-based vaccination activities, typically in conjunction with a medical partner, and also to address other barriers, including transportation or other barriers related to mobility. Next slide, please. So our priorities in terms of populations I alluded to earlier are the population groups where we see lower rates of vaccination so far, and that includes farm and ag workers, immigrants and refugees, BIPOC populations broadly. And also, I think of particular interest to this group is unsheltered and homeless populations, as well as I've heard a couple questions on the call related to people with disabilities. And in our state, we are also looking at vaccination efforts by county, because we see a lot of variability geographically. So we're trying to prioritize funding or higher levels of funding where in geographies where the uptake is lower in general. Next slide. So what we're learning, so as I mentioned, we are a grant making entity. And so what we're learning is coming from looking at a couple hundred applications for funding from community-based organizations. So I share this perspective as a grant maker, not as a public health official. We are seeing a lot of variability by geography, where both, geography in general, and usually by county line, but also within geographies and by population group. We're learning that messaging really matters. People are really tuned into what they're being told about vaccines, as well as who's presenting that information. And unfortunately, we don't think there's sort of a single set of messages that seem to appeal universally to all audiences. We do know that the messenger matters, so people tend to gravitate towards people they trust, and that who's trusted is a variable by population. We also know that people often need multiple touch points to choose to get vaccinated, that they won't, if they have questions, they need to be able to get those questions answered, and what those questions are is highly personal and variable. And one sort of general rule of thumb we're seeing that seems to be resonant is that people who are choosing to get vaccinated are often motivated by their desire to be able to reunite with friends and families again. So if there is a sort of common message that seems to work, that's one of them. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're seeing from grantees and groups that we're funding, that there is a ton of opportunity with vaccination efforts for collaboration across nonprofit organizations. So most of our proposals that we've been receiving include multiple CBOs partnering together to co-host events, which typically means one organization providing, a site or facility to host a vaccination event, but lots of other groups playing a role in outreach and recruitment and registration support to get participants there, or to let folks know that an event is happening. We've seen lots of requests, and I think this is a really popular approach, to bring the events to trusted community-based sites. So if you have a facility that people are accustomed to visiting, bringing the vaccination event there rather than relying on mass vac sites that are typically offered by the public sector. We've seen this be really successful in churches and in housing communities and in some really non-traditional settings as well. We've also seen a lot of interesting applications from folks that are sort of outside of your typical healthcare or social support types of entities. For example, we recently funded a request that was a partnership with the 4-H as a way to appeal to younger audiences in a community that had really low vaccination rates in a particular population. And we're seeing kind of growing interest in a shift in the tone of events from a kind of solemn, this is like a medical appointment, to this is something to celebrate that more of us in our community are getting vaccinated. So more requests that include elements of kind of art and music that we believe will encourage folks to have a positive experience while they're choosing, if they choose to get vaccinated. One more slide, I believe. And just a few thoughts on the funding context. In Washington, we're seeing a lot of investment, public sector investment, particularly through the Department of Health, in vaccination efforts and at the county level, including around, as I'm sure you're all experiencing in your states, a lot of kind of mass messaging and kind of public service announcements, as well as very population-specific messaging that is being funded by the public sector. In our case, we're seeing less funding available to provide direct support to community-based organizations to provide the work that they do to draw people into those events and really leverage their networks and their trusted relationships to encourage people to participate in vaccination efforts, or to bring culturally or linguistically specific experts from their own communities to represent and provide information about vaccines to their constituency. So there seems to be less public sector dollars for that type of effort, even though we know it's a really influential approach to get community members to participate in vaccine efforts. And in Washington, we're also seeing a high degree of variability across counties based on the regional public health infrastructure. So in my home county of King County, we're having, I think, a really reasonably strong effort, and that's very different for other parts of the state where the public health infrastructure isn't as robust and mobilized as it might be in a more densely urban community like where I live in Seattle. And then finally, we're seeing some good work being done with corporate partners, like the rideshare programs that have donated rides for people going to and from vaccine efforts, as well as creating other incentives that will encourage folks or offset the cost of choosing to get vaccinated for folks that need to miss work. So we're seeing some creative use of incentives that might be an interesting thing to consider in your local communities. So my goal was really just to share some examples with you of what we've seen working here in Washington, in the hope that it sparks some ideas for you. And I will just put my the link to the All in Washington website information, as well as email address if anybody has any questions and wants to follow up. In the interest of time, I didn't queue up the question slide, but Diane.
Thanks so much, Erin. That's really good work and helpful information. And I think it will inspire and assist a lot of other communities to replicate these efforts. There's a couple questions asking if they can see the puppy.
Oh, the puppy. Maybe I'll bring him back. Him in the right. We're gated right now. Sorry.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And Amanda Reicher saying that this work is really critical because it sounds like you're experiencing a surge again in King County. And Jerry is saying thanks for your work and asking if beyond vaccination needs, are you also able to open the community conversation about affordable, accessible homes as a public health outcome to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic?
That is a really good question. We haven't had a grant making focus yet on that, but we do have representation on our advisory group of housing advocates. And one of the things that we have what we did early on was we did a whole grant making round focused on providing emergency flexible financial assistance. So those were grants to community-based organizations to provide immediate cash relief to their constituencies. And part of the logic of that grant making program was to provide cash support that would allow some of those community members to use that funding to stay housed. And I think where we've been able to advocate for the importance of stable housing to our elected officials who have come into contact with this effort we have, where possible.
Okay, thanks, Erin. And there's multiple requests for this PowerPoint. So just an assurance to everybody that we will be sending this out in the follow-up materials. So Erin, thanks again so much for your work and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
All right, take care. So we're going to turn now to Bob Palmer as our next field update. Before we do, I just want to let everybody know that Sarah Hasmer from National Women's Law Center will be on the call after Bob. So I know several of you have asked really good and important questions about impact of the pandemic, specifically on women. And I'm sure that Sarah will have very good answers and she will be up on the agenda pretty soon. So first I'm going to turn to Bob Palmer, who's Policy Director at Housing Action Illinois, also a board member of the National Income Housing Coalition, to share what's happening in Illinois. So Bob, thanks for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I just have 3 slides. You can go to the first slide. So I'm here to talk about a bill that just passed the Illinois General Assembly after many, many months of work trying to get it passed and gone through various iterations. It's called the COVID-19 Emergency Housing Act. It just passed the General Assembly last week. It's currently or soon to go to Governor Pritzker here in Illinois for his signature. I just put in the chat the link to the actual bill language on the General Assembly website if people want to take a look at it. And basically this bill has 3 or 4 main provisions. One, it puts in state statute how the state of Illinois will use its portion of the emergency rental assistance funds from the December 2020 COVID-19 relief bill. Illinois as a whole is getting about $835 million, and the state portion of that is about $566 million. This particular bill is just focused on that state portion that's going to be administered by our Illinois Housing Development Authority and also the Illinois Department of Human Services. And this was a process of negotiation with the various state agencies and the governor's office administering the program. So it's very much in line with what they were, planning on doing based on feedback they got from us and others. And it includes certain things that were important to us, building on the successes of our 2020 rent assistance program, like having explicit language that there's no written lease required for tenants to be eligible, that there will be an opportunity for tenants to apply directly for assistance if the landlords choose not to participate, and that the amount of assistance provided is based on need rather than the flat amount that was in the state 2020 program. And there's also, it goes into details about, communication with the tenant and the landlord, and what to do if the application is found deficient and not having documentation, and making clear there's opportunities for errors in applications to be fixed and that sort of thing. So we're anticipating that the state program will be launching in May. There is also some temporary foreclosure protections for single-family homeowners and owners of small apartment buildings, pausing judicial sales and orders of possessions through the end of July. The part that the groups in our coalition were actually most focused on were the eviction ceiling components. So that was my group, Housing Action Illinois, the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, and many others. Even before the pandemic, we had been working to change Illinois' relatively restrictive discretionary eviction ceiling statute to give more opportunities for people to get their eviction records sealed. So just for example, if you have an eviction filing against you, but there was never any judgment by the court that you should be evicted, that would not be, if that record is sealed, it would be less of an obstacle to that person being able to find housing in the future. And we also wanted to work on restricting tenant screening companies and how they, keeping them from reporting on sealed eviction records and having actually penalties if they do so. So actually, if you want to go to the next slide, basically the bill that passed focuses on the eviction ceiling in two different ways. One, during what we define in the act as this COVID-19 emergency period going back to March of 2020, when Governor Pritzker did the first emergency declaration, and going through March of 2022, this is a date we negotiated with groups that were opposed to the original bill, like the realtors and other groups representing rental property owners. Basically, during that period, all eviction records will be sealed with some limited opportunities or for records being unsealed if the eviction was related to an issue other than payment of the rent. So we know obviously the vast majority of cases are about non-payment of rent. So the vast majority of cases will be sealed. I should also say in Illinois, we still do have the state eviction moratorium that's somewhat stronger than the federal moratorium. Governor Pritzker just extended it for another month, and we're advocating for that as long as it's necessary, but definitely until this bill gets signed into law. So through the negotiation process and working with our champions in the General Assembly, like State Representative Delia Ramirez, Senator Omar Aquino, and others, we're actually able to get the groups representing rental property owners to be neutral on this and other ceiling provisions. And then you can go to the next slide. The bill also creates opportunities for even expanded sealing of eviction cases before the pandemic. And I just pasted in here a comparison of what's in the new state law, basically saying that once this gets signed into law and through July of 2022, upon a motion of someone going to court, the court shall order the sealing of any court file in a residential eviction action if the interests of justice in sealing the court file outweigh the public interest in maintaining the public record, or if the parties to the eviction action agree to this court file. So if the landlord says they're okay, if that's something negotiated, then it would be sealed. Also, if there was no material violation of the lease, or if the case was dismissed, those cases would be sealed. And then in the second bullet point, you can compare that to what's in currently in state law that's very restrictive by comparison, saying that the court may may seal an eviction order if the court finds the plaintiff's action is sufficiently without basis or fact in law, which is hard to prove, and that placing the court file under seal is clearly in the interest of justice. So you can obviously compare that to what we were able to get in the new state law, and that the interests are not outweighed by the public interest in knowing about the record. So again, in the new state law, that is flipped. And so sort of the assumption is that the way it's drafted, that the emphasis will be on sealing it, and then there has to be a good reason not to seal it. So, you know, again, even before the pandemic, we knew that eviction filings were a major obstacle to people finding housing, for people who just had a filing, or even if, and also for people who had a court-ordered eviction. Often tenant screening companies don't really differentiate in the information they present to landlords. Landlords increasingly rely on these screening records to make a decision about who they're going to rent to. So this was something that was very important to us to pass, and have been for a long time. So we're very glad it's finally passed the General Assembly, and we're looking forward to Governor Pritzker signing it soon. So I'll conclude there.
Great work, Bob. Thanks so much for sharing it. We really appreciate your leadership in this way, and getting this important legislation passed. I think it's a good example too of, you know, some people ask rightfully, what's taking so long for some states to get their ERA programs up and running? And I think this is a really good example of where taking a little bit more time to get it right and include really important protections for tenants is a good thing, and a good reason for, you know, taking a little bit longer to get the program up and running. There's a couple questions that I'll combine into one for you around what about our evictions based on lease expiration during the pandemic also sealed, and sort of a remark that sometimes landlords are using those types of evictions as they're out, and a need to protect tenants there too. And then also a question of, if the evictions are sealed, will the landlord then just assume that the tenant had problems with the landlord for non-payment, and what might that mean for the tenant?
Excellent questions. Well, actually, one way our state eviction moratorium is stronger than the federal one is that it protects people who are up to date on their rent and have just come to the end of their lease term and are on sort of an oral month-to-month, and those people cannot be evicted, and they don't have to provide any declaration to their landlord or to the court to be protected. And so right now in Illinois, the only evictions that can happen under the moratorium, if the landlord is making the case that people or property, there's a health or safety issue being raised. So if it's just non-payment, again, those are covered. Also, the landlord has to provide a copy of the declaration similar to the federal declaration, but the landlord has to affirmatively provide the copy to the tenant, which helps ensure that the tenant actually knows about it. So yes, those cases would be sealed. And then to the second question, I think if the case is sealed and there's penalties against tenant screening companies from reporting on sealed eviction records, then there's no reason for that eviction record existing to come up during the rental process. There is a provision in the law that does allow landlords, in terms of providing references and so forth, they can say, you know, they filed an eviction against me, and doing that doesn't violate the law. So the restriction is just on the commercial use of eviction records.
That's great. Thanks so much, Bob. Really appreciate your good work on this, and thank you for sharing it as a source of inspiration for others to follow in other states. So thanks for joining today.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to turn to our next speaker now, which is Sarah Hasmer from National Women's Law Center, to talk about a new report on new findings on racial and gender analysis of housing insecurity that were reported in the Census Household Pulse survey. So Sarah, thanks so much for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. So I'm Senior Counsel for Income Security at the National Women's Law Center. Unfortunately, the two co-authors of this fact sheet from our research team couldn't be here. So you have a lawyer who is very interested in data with you instead. So I will preface this with, if there isn't a question that I can answer, I will provide my email address so that we can follow up with you after, but I'll do my best to answer what questions come up. So I'm putting a link in the chat right now to a landing page with all of our census pulse survey data analysis. So you can not only access this particular fact sheet, but also the previous ones as well. So this survey, we analyzed the March 3rd through 15th census household pulse survey data. And so that likely captures some benefits from emergency rental assistance that was passed in December, because at least a little bit of those programs were opened. But for the most part, it doesn't capture benefits that people have received from the March rescue plan. So some of the key takeaways, and these have been trends over time that we've noticed as well. So Black, non-Hispanic women and Latinas have been more likely to be in households that have lost employment income since March 2020. And we've also noticed that Asian non-Hispanic women, Black non-Hispanic women, and Latinas were more likely to report that they expected their household to lose employment income in the next 4 weeks. We also found that Black non-Hispanic women and Latinas were more likely to be behind on their rent payments. There's just a challenge with the survey sample with Asian non-Hispanic women that we can't affirmatively, definitively say that they were more likely to be behind on their rent compared to white non-Hispanic men. But non-definitively, it looks like that's the result as well, that you will see on an incoming chart. We can definitively say that Asian, Black, and Latina women were more likely to be behind on their mortgage payments. And then also for those interested in food insecurity, we did some analysis on that as well and found that Black non-Hispanic women and Latinas were more likely to than white non-Hispanic men to not have enough food to eat in the past 7 days. Next slide, please. So here's one of the graphs that relates to these employment impacts. So you can really see the differences between white non-Hispanic men. About 42% have reported losing employment income since March 2020, all the way up to more than 59% of Latinas reported that. And as you may expect, that then has an impact on ability to pay rent. Next slide. And so here we have our graph of the behind on rent or mortgage payments. So nearly 4.7 million women, about 17% of women who rent, reported being behind on their rent in the first half of March 2021. And among renters, more than 1 in 4 Black non-Hispanic women and more than 1 in 5 Latinas and Asian non-Hispanic women reported being behind on their rent. In comparison, 12.3% of white non-Hispanic men. You can, as I mentioned, I put the link to other fact sheets on there. While because of some margins of error and the survey samples, we can't definitively say how things have changed over time. I will say that at least in this slice of the data, the Asian non-Hispanic women stat is much higher than some of the previous slices of the data. Next slide, please. And so this data really demonstrates that it's really important for those eviction moratoria, especially if there are state local moratoriums that you might be able to have that could be better than the federal moratorium. Of course, we also support the CDC improving that moratorium as well. And then the urgency of that emergency rental assistance. I will also add that you can pull national and state data for gender or race ethnicity analysis, and I put the link to that in the chat. You can't do the crosstab analysis that we've done. That comes from public use files that I believe are only available for national analysis, but I really encourage states to analyze their state level data. One of the intriguing things that I found for late March slice of the data was that in California, 18% of women were behind on their rent compared to 15% of men. And then 31% of Asian non-Hispanic, 22% of Black non-Hispanic, and 17% of Latinx renter households were behind in rent. And so while we were able to do the crosstab of gender plus race analysis, that is really nationwide. And so as you might imagine, there are different communities in different states, and they're facing some various impacts. And so when possible, especially if you have a bigger state like California, where there's a bit more confidence in bigger sample sizes, it's really useful to pull that state level analysis. And the next set of data tables, so those are, you can look at either the gender analysis or the race ethnicity from the second half of April. Those will be released on Wednesday. And so you can pull those tables from the link that I shared on Wednesday. The public use files that NWLC uses for our crosstab analysis are released 2 weeks after that. So unfortunately, our data analysis is a little bit behind, but we were very happy to provide a sort of pre-ARPA slice of the data and look forward to hopefully in June or so providing another slice so that we can see some of the impacts of the rescue plan. Next slide. And so I will just say that while women of color in particular were especially likely to be behind on rent during COVID-19, this is just an exacerbation of a housing insecurity issue that predated the pandemic. And I saw some discussion in the chat about that as well. And so we can't just address the back rent, we really need to address the long-term strategic issues. And so we are very much support of NLIHC's HoUSed campaign to address housing insecurity in the long term, including universal vouchers. We knew even though women and girls comprise the majority of HUD rental assistance participants, they are still more likely than white non-Hispanic men to be cost burdened, severely cost burdened, and to be extremely low income renters. And so we really need to address that issue, as well as a source of income discrimination. I saw that mentioned in the chat as well. We fully support that, as it also has a tendency to impact disproportionately households that are headed by women. So, thank you very much for having me on. Happy to answer questions.
Sarah, thanks so much. Thanks for the work that you've done on this, and thanks for the partnership in the work throughout the pandemic and for the long-term solutions. There's one question that came through asking if the analysis is by individual or it's households headed by women.
Great question. So I believe that it is households headed by women. And I will add that an additional change that we made this time compared to previous times, we used to include data about households with children. There's a bit of a sort of data discrepancy about how do you define household? And so we think that this data might include women who have like multiple families that are doubling up, for example. So the children reported in that data might not be the woman's own children. So that's just a little nuance. But you will have single women, you will have mothers, you will have women who are in families doubling up.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And you already addressed some of the other questions and comments that came in. Many people asking for this data, wanting to see the breakout for women, and also noting that the housing security that existed during the pandemic was largely because of what existed pre-pandemic. So thanks for addressing that. And thanks again for joining us today.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks. All right, now I'm going to turn to Kim Johnson, my colleague from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, to give the latest update on advancing the long-term solutions that Sarah mentioned and others. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Diane, and hi, everyone. My name is Kim Johnson, and I'm filling in today for Sarah to bring you the latest updates from Capitol Hill. So last week, President Biden unveiled the outlines of his American Families Plan, which is a $1.8 trillion companion bill to the $2.5 trillion American Jobs Plan. The American Families Plan would invest in education, childcare, and paid leave, as well as expanding nutrition assistance for children and permanently extending enhancements to the child tax credit, among other priorities. Notably missing from the proposal is a plan to make rental assistance universally available to all eligible households, which is a core element of President Biden's housing platform and central to any successful strategy to solve the housing crisis. Several moderate Republicans, including Senator Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia, are expected to meet with the president this week to continue negotiations on a potential bipartisan infrastructure bill. 2 weeks ago, Senate Republicans announced plans for a $568 billion infrastructure bill focused on roads, bridges, airports, and waterways, or what the Republican senators are defining as traditional infrastructure, but nothing to address the affordable housing crisis. The proposal has been touted as an opening bid for negotiations, and President Biden is reportedly taking the offer more seriously than he took the Republicans' coronavirus relief bill, which was immediately panned as inadequate. Top Republican and Democratic leaders in the Senate have also been meeting to seek a deal on a smaller scale bipartisan bill. The president is expected to meet with top Republican and Democratic leaders in the House and Senate on May 12th, with the potential goal of reaching a bipartisan deal by Memorial Day, although some congressional leaders are reluctant to set a deadline for negotiations. So that leaves us with two possibilities. One, a smaller infrastructure package that passes with bipartisan support, followed by a package that includes the provisions left out of the bipartisan deal that can pass through reconciliation. Or if a bipartisan deal is unattainable, one massive infrastructure package that passes using reconciliation. The weeks leading up to Memorial Day will be pivotal in determining which provisions ultimately make it into the infrastructure package. So it is more important than ever that advocates are weighing in with their members of Congress about the importance of including housing provisions in the infrastructure package. And those provisions include an expansion of housing assistance to every eligible household, $70 billion to fully address the capital repair backlog in public housing, and at least $40 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to expand and preserve our nation's supply of affordable and accessible housing for the lowest income people. You can also take action by signing your organization onto a national sign-on letter urging Congress to support these investments in affordable housing at the link that I am about to drop in the chat. And so that is it for me. Diane actually had to jump off to make it to a speaking engagement. So I'm just gonna, take us out. So thank you all for joining us today and every week. We will be back again next week with another national call. And in the meantime, if you are not yet sick of us, you are always welcome to join one of our other working group calls. So tonight, actually, we have a Tenant Talk live session at 6 p.m. that will cover the intersection of environmental and housing justice. Tomorrow, we have our legislative working group where we convene to come up with some policy recommendations for the federal infrastructure package. And we also have DHRC's, the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition's Recovery Working Group on Tuesdays at 3. Wednesdays are state and local implementation working groups led by myself and my colleague Tori Bourret. And Thursday we have a Puerto Rico working group every other Thursday. So please join us, and in the meantime, take good care. We look forward to seeing you all soon, and thank you for the incredible work you do. Have a great day, everyone.